I actually think he would love to chicken out at this moment, but is unable to do so.
For Trump, it's a war of choice, trying to fight it as far as possible bloodlessly from the American point of view. He's exposed that American weakness. And, China will be watching.
The Chinese timetable was widely expected to be 2027 for some sort of invasion. The pressure against this, obviously, is the American security guarantee. The American security guarantee just doesn't look that credible anymore. Hello and welcome to the Fourcast Indicators with me, Krishnan Guru-Murthy.
And I'm Mark Urban. And on the Fourcast Indicators, we try to home in on the really significant things that analysts might be looking at. We separate the wheat from the chaff, the signal from the noise, and try to see which way the story's going.
Again this week, we are focusing, of course, on Iran, where the American blockade is stopping things going out and in to Iran, and the Iranian blockade is stopping most of everything else. Is it a stalemate? The talks in Pakistan, the second round of talks, don't seem to be going anywhere. So are we heading towards some sort of fizzling out? The ceasefire certainly is indefinite now. Mark, what do you think is the first thing to look at?
Well, what I'm really curious to see is, does the US Navy ease the blockade a bit? Do they look the other way a bit, or maybe quite a lot, in order to encourage the Iranians back to the table while saying that actually the blockade is still theoretically in place? Because it's pretty clear from the last attempt to get them together at the end of last week that the Iranians are not going to come back to the table while the blockade is still in place. So if you subscribe to the Trump always chickens out view of this and think he's really desperate to close it down, should we be looking for signs? And I have to say, looking at all the sort of tracking websites and those kinds of things, I don't see it yet. So, for example, just yesterday, during the night, the US Navy boarded a tanker called the Majestic X, which has a Guyana flag without the consent of the Guyanese authorities, but is effectively a dark fleet Iranian tanker carrying Iranian oil. So as of the middle of last night, they were still enforcing it.
I mean, each position is very mysterious today, because the American position in the last few hours has been, well, the Iranian maintenance of their blockade is not a breaking of the ceasefire, as far as we're concerned, even though, the Iranians are showing pictures, apparently, of troops boarding ships and threatening to fire on them. And the Iranian position is very much that, the American blockade is a violation of our agreement.
An act of war, they say.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, clearly Iran would like a situation where they stop the Gulf Arab states or whoever else getting oil out and imports in, and they carry on trading as normal. But I think, in a way, the imposition of the American blockade was quite a decisive moment, in the sense that for a few weeks, the Iranians had really dominated escalation after the Israelis hit the Pars gas field, and they then started hitting the gas facilities in Qatar and various other things. Trump seemed to be powerless. And the blockade has definitely focused minds in Tehran. Why didn't the Americans do it sooner? Possibly because they were trying to contain the oil price shock. Now, certainly at the start of this, we know very well that the Israelis and the Americans were overly optimistic, deluded, some would say, about the effects of killing the Iranian leadership, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and that would cause some kind of implosion of the regime. And consequently, there are elements that they really needed to be in place that weren't. So, for example, when we learned that those US Marines were sailing from Okinawa several weeks ago, they've given the ability to board ships and stuff like that Marine expeditionary unit, and it wasn't really there when this started. So they weren't, in a sense, fully lined up to impose a blockade. And that's another reason, along with the economic implications, that they probably didn't do it sooner.
I mean, the effect of the American blockade is also not quite what was talked up right at the beginning when they started doing this almost 2 weeks ago, which was to say, that, Iran had about 10 days to 2 weeks before it would have to start shutting down oil production because there was nowhere to store the oil because they were using ships as it was to store their oil, and that once they shut down, these were not things that could easily be started up again because, water floods in and they're effectively over. That doesn't seem to have happened. And the Iranians seem to think that they've got more time than we thought.
Yes. Well, look, another narrative I think that has prevailed throughout this is that the Iranians have got a higher pain threshold. And there is the question, when the blockade was announced, how rigorous was it? Did the Americans kind of feel their way into it? Because, as you know, Krish, there are lots of open source intelligence people, and there are sites like tankertrackers.com, which use ship positioning data, satellite photography, Lloyd's List, all sorts of other data to work out what's going in and out. And they were saying that some of these Iranian ships were still getting out. And last night, CENTCOM, the US military in the area, said, no, it's not true. They denied that they'd been letting ships out and say that they've intercepted 31 or caused them to turn around by radio messages. But there is the suspicion that some people are successfully still running the blockade. The FT did a piece on this morning. And that works both ways. Some people are beating the Iranian blockade too by hugging the Omani coast. And the data, this ship data system, AIS, is constantly being spoofed and deceived, or ships that are trying to run the strait are either turning it off or spoofing their location. So it's very hard to get accurate data on who is going in and out.
Now, last time you talked about, the imminent arrival of a third aircraft carrier. And there are, more than a dozen American ships now sort of trying to enforce this
a couple
blockade.
of dozen. Yeah.
But what is this doing for the reputation of the American military? That it is not conclusive what they can achieve. They certainly can't reopen the strait. They haven't been able to achieve a military victory. The most sophisticated, most powerful military in the world doesn't look like it's winning.
I think this whole question about, is the US Navy no longer able to guarantee freedom of navigation on the seas, that kind of thing, conceptual, quite a big concept in terms of global trade, international law, the so-called rules-based order, when we know Trump doesn't care too much about that. But I think for lots of countries, like those Southeast Asian countries running out of oil right now, there are some pretty big implications in that. And I think it's definitely true that with the forces that the Americans had at the beginning, and even with the reinforced forces they have now with those marine task groups and a few more ships in the area, they do not have the military means to force open the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you were to say to me, well, then America can't do it, maybe with 6 months of mobilization, of, minesweepers, ships in reserve helicopter squadrons that are used for minesweeping, thousands more troops potentially to land on the islands in this strait. Possibly they could do it, but it's really shown us the limitations of American naval power in that sense. And China will be watching, as the Chief of Naval Staff said this week in testimony to the Senate, and that, in a sense, he was saying, we have to win this one, or China will draw its conclusions vis-a-vis the Taiwan Strait.
Yes, and that America will not be able to guarantee any security to Taiwan. I mean, hasn't it also, though, changed our notion of what warfare is? That it is not about two militaries confronting each other and it being a battle of who has got the most ships and the most planes and the most forces. It is about the use of levers like the Strait of Hormuz to pressure the whole global economy. And in that respect, American dominance and American military supremacy looks a whole lot different.
Yes. Well, it slightly depends whether you think, we've said from the start that, for the regime in Tehran, it is a war of survival. For Trump, it's a war of choice. For Netanyahu, it's somewhere between the two sort of thing. But I definitely, from Trump's point of view, he's not going to mobilize, the United States Marine Reserves or the Reserve Naval Fleet, or whatever. Those things he'd have to do. So in that sense, it's not war in the classic, World War II sense of applying all of one's national resources to achieving an end result. It's a limited war, a war of choice. And in trying to fight it in this way and trying to fight it as far as possible bloodlessly from the American point of view. He's exposed that American weakness.
And as a longer-term indicator, militarily, what are you looking at?
Well, a lot of people, when we started with this, were asking questions about what's called by the Pentagon and other militaries magazine depth. In other words, in those bunkers in Norfolk, Virginia, or somewhere out Midwest or whatever, how many Patriot missiles have you got? How many naval missiles? Torpedoes, all the other paraphernalia of war, the expendables. Now, obviously, when you buy a new Patriot missile and it's $4 million a time, you tend not to build up too big a stock. That's been the problem during those long years that the US was just confronting insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, people who couldn't shoot their planes down or fire ballistic missiles at them. I mean, the UK even more so ran down all those stocks. And so we knew going into the war, and there was a lot of speculation that the Iranian missiles might exhaust the defensive missile stocks like Patriot, like the one called I think it's the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System, or Talon, which is the one that actually intercepts missiles in space. The super expensive, that's $12 million around. Now we find out there was a leak to CNN earlier this week. The stocks of Talon and Patriot, the defensive ones, had been reduced by about a third during the exchanges of October 2024 and then June 2025, when the Iranians were firing at Israel. We now know that they're down to half level. And we also know that some of their attack missiles, there's a new one that they've used. In fact, it's been implicated in that tragedy at the school in Mihab on the second day of the war, I think it was, called PRISM, which is a very advanced attack missile. They've apparently fired off 45% of their stock of those. Now, I think in a way people saw this through the wrong prism. They thought, oh, well, as soon as they're getting low, they're going to have to sue for peace, which is not quite right. There are other reasons why Trump wants out of this. But I think it does leave real serious worries in the Pentagon and elsewhere, in Japan, in Taiwan, about what on earth would the US do if there was a big emergency in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. And that's, we believe, what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, specifically warned Trump about a couple of weeks before this started. We can sort of do this, he said, but we've really got to think whether that leaves us defenseless vis-a-vis China. So quite a big point for the Pentagon when it's supposed to be focusing primarily on the Chinese challenge.
I mean, I want to talk about China later on, but I mean, just in terms of sort of the geopolitics, China has been relatively quiet. It's been doing a lot of diplomacy behind the scenes. It's been putting pressure on Iran. It's been saying the strait needs to be reopened. It's been working with the Pakistanis. But there's this sort of assumption that all eyes are on the Trump visit to go and meet Xi next month, around mid-May, and that they don't want to rock the boat. And that sort of chimes with what they were saying to me when I was in China when Starmer was there, which was that they want now to be seen as upholding the old-fashioned international order and doing things the old-fashioned way.
Yeah, that's what you think is the reason for their relative quiescence.
Well, I think they want to be seen as a reliable believer in the international rules-based order and not part of the Trumpian upheaval of everything that's going on. And they also have to keep their eye on their international relationships. I mean, they remember are friends with everybody in that region. They have relationships with Israel, with the Gulf states, with Saudi Arabia, as well as Iran. And arguably their relationship with Saudi Arabia is more important than their relationship with Iran in terms of the future supply of oil for China.
Yeah, I think you're bang on there. And it's interesting that one of the few things that have been said publicly was Xi Jinping did say, we can't accept the law of the jungle, which is exactly your point about China wanting to position itself as the responsible, wise status quo power in a way. And I think you're also right that they're looking in many ways to capitalize at the end of this on the sort of degradation of American credibility to the Gulf states. The Gulf states having urged time and again, don't do this, having their will ignored by Trump, then dealing with all the awful consequences of being hammered by Iran. And China definitely wants to capitalize on that diplomatically, commercially, in all sorts of other ways. So I think that's right. They can't be seen as taking Iran's side of this and openly siding. Now, fascinatingly, with that ship that was stopped going in to Iran at the start of this week, I've got to remind myself of the name, the Tusker. Now, that was a container vessel sailing in, of course, with imports to Iran. Now, Trump has tried to imply that there was Chinese weaponry on board. I'm not sure. I mean, China seems to be denying that. But, I mean, Trump seems to be trying to deny them that position of having it both ways and trying to put them in the frame as being on Iran's side, but precisely because he's presumably getting anguished calls from MBS in Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis and everyone else saying, you know, you've got to stand with us and don't sell us out. And quite a dilemma, I think, for China.
It's worth remembering that quote from the Indian Foreign Minister, Jay Shankar, who was an ambassador to China for a long time, who said in that period after 2000, when America was again in the Middle East, bogged down, he characterized the relationship as, China is winning but not fighting, and America is fighting but not winning. And I think that's how China would hope the dynamic to continue now.
Yes.
I want to bring in a guest now, because we have Ann Pettifor, the eminent economist and author whose latest book is The Global Casino. And she's been an advisor to many people around the world, not least a previous incarnation of the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell. And thank you for joining us. You have now sort of written on your Substack that you feel compelled to come out and say you think the world, despite the ceasefire, despite all the optimistic talk from Trump and others, that the world is heading for a global economic slump.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, by the way, for having me on. But the most visible shock is on tankers and, if you like, and everything that's happening at sea. But in reality, the much more damaging shock is already moving through the global system. We're seeing that there's a problem with vessels not leaving the Gulf, 6 weeks behind docking where they should be docked. We've seen that inventories are not being drawn down, and that when production plans should already have been turned into output, that's already blocked. Now, that's building up already. The tanker that was due to have left 6 weeks ago is still not left. It should have arrived at dock in China, in Asia mainly, and where there's a cargo waiting to be loaded back onto the ship to become home. Those cargoes on the dockside are going to build up and back up, if you like, as production arrives at the port. So we've got a real big problem already, and that still hasn't kind of manifested itself because we're still so focused on the oil price, when actually the fertilizer price and the shortage of fertilizer, potassium and sulfur is actually much, much bigger problem. We're so focused on the Gulf, we can't see what is already happening down the system change.
I mean, we're seeing obviously the immediate impact, as you say, on fuel prices showing through in our domestic inflation rates already. But what is it that's coming down the track next? What is the next wave of this that you think takes us into, potential recession?
So, Krishnan, the point is this, that, at the moment Trump embarked on this war, Trump and Netanyahu, the global economy was deeply unbalanced. I predicted the global financial crisis in 2005-06, when global debt was to 120% of GDP. And I argued that because the debt was so high relative to global income, GDP, it would not in the end be repaid, and that would cause a crisis. And so indeed it did. Then after the crisis, debts were resolved really through bankruptcy largely, but then they built up in advance of COVID when debt rose to about 158% of GDP. And that precipitated another crisis at the time of COVID. In fact, a great financial crisis, which we often overlook. The global debt now is back down again to about 130% of GDP, but it's still massively unbalanced. So we have trade imbalances, which cause political tensions, which has led to the rise of tariffs and so on from the United States. But we also have financial imbalances, and in continents like Africa, which are going to be so badly damaged by the failure of these stocks to flow from the Gulf to markets across Africa. Those countries are already dealing with sovereign debt crises. So I'm trying to argue that, and then of course in the United States we have a bubble. We have a massive AI bubble. So these are all imbalances, huge amounts of corporate borrowing with no real indication of where the profits and income for repaying that borrowing is coming from in the case of AI. These imbalances already exist. At this point, Trump sort of chucks a wrecking ball at the global economy. And I must say that from where I sit, it looks like an attack on Asia, but also in particular on China, because most of the goods that were due to leave via the Gulf were really heading towards Asia. And I'm with you that China's playing a clever role here, but it must be very, very testing for her because, as Helen Thompson has argued, this appears to be an attack on China, really.
I wanted to ask you about the disconnect between this kind of looming disaster, which seems inescapable given everything you've said, all those indicators about fertilizer and other products that not leaving, and the relatively buoyant state of markets. Now, you've mentioned the US market, but it's not just there, is it?
No.
Europe, the Israeli stock market at a kind of high. I mean, why is there this disconnect, given that there seems to be this kind of doom juggernaut just down the road?
Well, I think partly I think it's delusional. And I've never trusted the judgment of markets when it comes to economic outcomes. But the point is also there's a lot of money around. Quite a lot of it comes through the shadow banking system. There's trillions of credit. There's $127 trillion of financial assets, if you like, in the shadow banking system. And a lot of this money is aimed at finite resources, at finite assets, like, for example, AI. And so the markets are reckoning that because the world seems to be awash with this cash, that actually all things will be resolved. And anyway, you can always trust Trump to chicken out and sort of sort it out. I actually think he would love to chicken out at this moment, but is unable to do so. So the markets are not, predicting that and not acting in line with that, I think are proving to be quite deceptive at the moment and delusional. And this has happened in the past. I mean, it certainly happened before the dot-com crisis and before the great financial crisis, when markets gave no indication that there was going to be an implosion.
And isn't it also the case that central banks in this situation will tend to concentrate on the headline figures of inflation rather than what they need to do to support individuals, consumers, and countries to try and weather the storm? I mean, the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee are unlikely to cut interest rates as they might have been expected to a couple of months ago next week. And, it's unlikely they will raise them at this stage, but, you never know what's going to happen down the road. They are still likely to say we need to strangle demand because inflation is above target.
Exactly. So, I mean, this is what is so, contradictory about central bank policy. And I'm worried about it because the Bank of England, at its last meeting, although they didn't declare they were going to raise rates, their statement was extraordinarily hawkish. And bond markets reacted violently to that. And everyone blames the bond market. But in fact, it was the Bank of England's hawkishness that triggered that. In the case of the Fed, they were very much more cautious about what they said, and they chose not to be hawkish, and they did not have a similar crisis. But the fact is that central banks do not have the tools that are needed to deal with global markets, fixed largely fixed by speculators.
I mean, clearly, global recession of the kind that you believe is coming will be intensely damaging to people's lives and livelihoods. I mean, in a domestic context, people say technically 2 successive quarters of negative growth is a recession. But I mean, what are you looking for on the global level to tell you that this moment that you're dreading is actually upon us? What are the key indicators?
So one of the key indicators is the strength of the dollar. I mean, the dollar was weakening, and the Trump administration was making deliberate efforts to weaken the dollar because they finally learned that actually a very strong dollar is bad for American manufacturing and American. But now, because of the crisis and because of it, it's still regarded as a safe haven. The dollar has strengthened, and the stronger it is, the worse it is for those countries that need dollars to buy pharmaceuticals and to buy oil. So that's one really important indicator. And the other is going to be the price of food. So you're going to see governments facing enormous political crises as people, of course, become very agitated over the fact they don't get their daily bread. That's another indicator. But I mean, there are just too many, it seems to me, at the moment. And there is just another indicator, of course, is what's happening in China. And China's growth appears to be slowing down. And we have to worry about that, I think, as well. Maybe that, fewer exports and also more imports and perhaps more expensive imports account for some of the imbalances in the Chinese economy. But these imbalances have been there for a long time, and they don't need to be rocked and shaken by some new shock.
But isn't it also the case that China has insulated itself to some degree from the short-term shocks by having bought a huge amount of oil in advance? And so they are sort of less affected than Europe. And the other people, of course, who are much less affected are the Americans.
But those who consume the stuff at the petrol pump are really hurting. And that's because the price of oil in the United States, despite the fact that the United States is awash with oil, is the global price, is $100 a barrel.
But I wonder whether this brings together,
China.
What Trump had been saying about Europe and NATO not getting involved in the Strait of Hormuz with the fact that America, doesn't need the oil that's coming out of there, and that's perhaps affecting, his relatively relaxed attitude now all of a sudden, rather mysteriously, towards Iran maintaining its blockade?
Well, I think that may well be the case. I mean, a little bit like people have said, all the way through the first term and this second term of Trump, he doesn't understand how NATO works and how, it's not a case of who puts what into some central kitty, it's what they're spending nationally. Similarly, I think there seems to be some evidence from his statements that he doesn't really get how this global oil price situation is going to work, because of course he sees the US as a net beneficiary of that, because it produces and exports so much energy now and gas, and that he doesn't seem to sort of get that. And I think you're right. I think that might be feeding into an attitude of, well, you may think you've got the higher pain threshold, but hey, it's not so bad for the US if prices stay this high for longer. I mean, against that has to be balanced his considerations about, $4 gas and the midterms and all the rest of it.
Well, Ann Pettifor, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ann.
Joining us. I wonder whether we should just sort of more explicitly talk about what China will be learning as it looks to American military power, as it thinks about its own ambitions for Taiwan. The Chinese timetable was widely expected to be 2027. That President Xi had reputedly told his military, that's when we want you to be ready to start enforcing a blockade of Taiwan or be ready for some sort of invasion. And the pressure against this, obviously, is the American security guarantee. The American security guarantee just doesn't look that credible anymore, does it? No. And I think even before this, there were a lot of people who really wondered what it amounted to, and would somebody who proudly proclaims American self-interest in the way that Trump does, America first and all the rest of it, would really risk
World War III to go to the aid of Taiwan, which as he has said, it's always been part of China anyway, sort of thing. So I think those doubts were there from the get-go. One slight dissenting thought. So I was talking to a senior Taiwanese official a couple of weeks ago who thinks that they won't entirely be drawing positive lessons from this. The Chinese sent some advanced air defense systems to Iran after last year's 12-day war, which apparently have all been taken out by the Israelis and the Americans, which has not been well received in Beijing and has caused, a sort of carpeting of the military, as if to say, what's wrong? Why are our more advanced air defense systems not apparently worth anything? So I think they will be drawing some lessons from this that are cautionary. But overall, yes, I mean, I think the war has exposed the limits of US naval power. And the point that you've been making is the way that China thinks strategically. So did have a 6-month reserve of oil ready to withstand various international crises, does have the manufacturing capability from production lines that are already going full tilt to exploit a surge in renewables, does have the manufacturing capability to fill its magazines of missiles with even more, to capitalize on the Americans running their defensive missile stocks down. I mean, they are in the most extraordinary position in that sense because they've thought strategically over the long term.
And by contrast, I mean, what feels like the absolute opposite in America, I mean, the thing we haven't mentioned actually is the slight political chaos in the Defense Department.
Yes.
Having just sacked the Secretary of the Navy when the Navy is at its most important moment in this whole crisis. Do we know what's behind that?
Allegedly, it's because he had not sufficiently gripped the problems in American shipyards, which, I mean, he hasn't had very long to do so. But that is a big problem in terms of the increasingly adverse relationship in numbers between the Chinese fleet and the US fleet. They are completely outproducing the Americans and, of course, have been for years. And they are now the largest fleet in the world, the Chinese. And, of course, Trump wants that dealt with as a matter of urgency. But I think the broader issue in the Pentagon is obviously the problems of working with Pete Hegseth, which, quite a few people have come unstuck there, both in the Secretary of Defence's office. You've got the head of the Army leaving early, Secretary of the Navy. He's got problems with the Secretary of the Army too, which have been widely reported. It's a pretty unhappy place to work, I think.
That's a good place to leave it, I think. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And that's it for the Fourcast Indicators.
Goodbye.